Are you ready to get messy in the best way possible? If you love getting inky, this video is for you. I'm diving into some of my favorite mixed media techniques using Tim Holtz Distress products, plus a touch of shimmer with Simon Hurley's Lunar Paste. I'm featuring the Stampers Anonymous June Curation stamps and stencils to pull it all together. Whether you're new to mixed media or looking for some fresh inspiration, I'll walk you through every step of the process. And as always, feel free to use your stash to play along. Now let's get into it. So the stamps and stencils I'm going to be working with are all from Tim Holtz with Stampers Anonymous. And first up, I've got the mini stencil set 7, and I'm going to be using specifically this stencil. And I'm also going to be using this one called Traveler. So it's stencil 043. And then a combination of stamps. So the main stamp sets I'm going to be using is the Classics #1. And I'm going to be using this beautiful dragonfly. And then I'm also going to be working with this fabulous Flourishes, which is CMS 070, and using this flourish stamp. And then I'm also going to be working with these mixed media stamps and stencils, but you could certainly switch these out for anything in your stash that's similar. This one is THMM 141. This one is THMM 119. And this is THMM 109. And this one, I'm just using the Hello Friend as the sentiment. So you could use any stamp set for that. On this one, I'm using this kind of text image, and I'm going to be using this stencil in the background. So if you've got a grid stencil or Tim's full-size grid stencil, or even the mini grid stencil that's a full stencil, you could use that. And then for this one, I'm using this little number design here. And again, like that's just a little ephemera piece that I'm using, so you could certainly switch that out or pull some other stamps from your stash. As with any of these, if you've got anything similar, feel free to pull from your stash to create along with me using the techniques I'm going to be sharing in this video. As for the mediums, I'm going to be working with Distress ink in Dusty Concord, Black Soot, Faded Jeans, Scorched Timber, and Walnut Stain. I'm going to be stamping with Archival ink and Black Soot, so I do recommend some sort of waterproof permanent ink for the stamping that we're going to be doing. I'm also going to be using Lunar Paste in Gold Rush from Simon Hurley. I've got some Distress Spritz here in Wilted Violet and Walnut Stain that we're going to be using to add a little shimmer. And then the spray stains here I've got are Pumice Stone, Faded Jeans, and Scorched Timber. And then as far as the paper goes, I'm going to be working on Distress Watercolor cardstock on the smooth side, and I've just cut the panel down to 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. Now let's get into the making. So before I ever get started on a card, I always like to do some practice stamping, especially when I'm kind of creating like a collage type background with my stamps. And as you can see here, I just practiced several times on, I started off on regular good watercolor cardstock and not thinking, and was like, oh yeah, let's practice this first. So, so that was my first practice, and then I just grabbed some printer paper and just used that to practice, kind of think about colors and, you know, maybe other stencils and things, but basically trying to figure out the layout of where I wanted to do the stamping to kind of create a balanced composition. And as you can kind of see with the progression here, you know, I was definitely going to keep that dragonfly the center focal point, and it was just a matter of figuring out what other stamps that I would want to use to add to that. And then I finally settled on this layout for the final card design. And then when you do that, it's really easy to use this kind of as a template for the rest of your stamping. So I like to put a little bit of like a temporary adhesive in the center of my stamping platform. You can also use a sticky mat. I just find when I stamp over the edge, then I've got a mat that I've got to clean off too. So you know, you can just place your template paper in your MISTI or stamping tool, and then you can place that other paper on top. But before you do that, you can kind of lay out your stamps and put them over and kind of line them up with where you had them on your template. So you can, get that dragonfly in there, and then you can just line up your good paper. Here I'm using distressed watercolor cardstock. As you know, that's always my favorite, and especially with all the different mediums that I'm going to be using on this card. So right now I'm just inking up the stamp with some black soot archival ink, and then I'm just going to stamp that onto the watercolor cardstock. Now, because the watercolor cardstock is a little more porous, if you really want a nice dark impression with your stamped image, sometimes you need to stamp it a couple times to really get a good image. And then I'm just going to continue stamping, kind of lining up everything as we go along here. So next up, I'm going to do the flourish image here. So we'll just, it doesn't have to be perfect, but the gist of it there. And we can line that paper up. There we go, stamp that one. And then we're going to kind of flip it around and get the image kind of off the edge there. And as you can see, that stamp is a little bit longer, so we'll just move our paper up here. And stamp that one. And as far as kind of figuring out where I wanted to stamp what, it was really just kind of how I like to repeat things across when I'm creating backgrounds. And this one was no exception. I kind of use these as borders on each side, but instead of having it centered, I kind of added them a little offset from each other just to add a little bit of interest there. Then, of course, the dragonfly is the center focal point, and then this text image, I'm just going to repeat multiple times across the background, and I'm going to use it about 3 different times. So I've got it up here at the top, over here, and then twice down here, but in essence, kind of using that in 3 areas to kind of move your eye across the background. So I'm just going to line that up. And I need to put my other foam piece back in the MISTI since I'm working with the clear photopolymer stamps. They're a little thinner than the rubber stamps, so I need that extra foam layer. And again, stamping that a couple times to get a good impression. And this is a pretty grungy stamp, so it's not going to give you a super crisp. I mean, the image is meant to be pretty distressed, as you can see there. So you're not going to get a crispy image there anyway. And I'll just stamp one more time across the bottom here. I don't really need to worry about lining that up because it was really just one more to fill in that bottom space there. And I'll line it up on this end. And then we'll one more time up in this upper corner here. All right, so now our stamping is completed and we're gonna move on to the next step. And then while we have the stamps out, I'm gonna go ahead and stamp that dragonfly image because we're going to fussy cut the main image there to create a layer on top of the one that we've already stamped. So, stamp that real good, get a good impression, and then we'll color and fussy cut that next. So next up, we're going to take some of the distress sprays and we're going to add some spray interest to the background. And I'm just going to, I've got faded jeans, I'm going to add a little color up in the corner here, and then Also going to add a little bit of pumice stone. And then we can use a little bit of water to kind of get those colors flowing a little bit more. Tilt it and move them around, let them blend. I'm going to get a little bit more pumice stone here. There we go. And then I'm going to just take my heat tool, give that a little bit of a dry, keep it moving. So if you've got those like drippies along the edge, you can kind of tap them off on a paper towel, or you can just kind of tilt it and kind of let it flow back into the center. And then we're just going to give that a real good dry before we go on to the next step, because we're going to continue layering colors onto this. And when you try to layer when the ink is still wet, it's just going to blend in. But if it's dry, it will layer and give you more visual interest. Next up, I'm going to just place my watercolor cardstock onto a sticky mat here. And I'm going to take the stencil that comes with this set, and I'm just going to add some interest with it across the background using some distress ink here in Faded Jeans and a little bit of a blending brush. Just going to pick up some ink onto the brush there and then I'm just going to apply the ink over the background here through the stencil. And you'll see what I mean by it layering, because we're going over Faded Jeans Distress Spray with Distress ink, and you can still see the stencil, which I think that really shows that layering ability that you get with these. So obviously the stencil is not long enough to go across the whole background, so because it's kind of a grid, you can just line it up and scoot it down and repeat a little bit more down on that lower corner there. And you can just pick it up here and there and see if you're getting enough ink, if you want to get it a little darker so you have a little more contrast for that stencil design. Just add a little more ink. There we go. And now we're going to do the same thing across on this side. And again, if you want to kind of use the grid from over here, you can just kind of line that up again. And then just remember, we're not using this upper half, so if you need to put something there to help kind of remind yourself, you can, or you just kind of remember as you're going. And there we have it. So kind of an easy way to get some unique layering and interest onto your background there. So now we're going to just add a little bit of some interest with some water splatters. So I'm just going to just kind of slow spritz this across the background. I'm not trying to miss the whole entire thing, but just add a little bit of interest here and there. So I'm pulling slow on that trigger to get kind of those larger water droplets, and then I'm just going to give that a dry. If there's areas where you want a little bit more, just add a little more water. And then just keep in mind that when you add water over those stenciled areas, like you can see it here, and you're going to lose some of that stencil detail. So just kind of keep that in mind when you're adding the water splatters. All right, so next up we're going to do some stamping with a stencil, or mono printing, as I like to call it. So I'm just going to be using some Distress Spray Stain. I'm going to spritz that over my stencil. You're going to get a good coverage of it there. So you're going to need a couple of paper towels to kind of block off where you don't want ink. is I don't want to transfer the ink that's along these flat edges on the background. I just want what's on the design part. So that's kind of why I've got those paper towels there at that angle. And now I can place this down on the paper. I'm going to take another paper towel and just place that on top very gently and just lightly rub over the stencil to pick up any ink that might be kind of bleeding out from underneath it. And then you can pick that up and you've got kind of that stamped image using the stencil. And so now I'm just going to repeat that along this side over here. So we'll just give this another spritz with the spray. And then I'm going to just kind of move my paper towels a little bit here. Kind of creating a mask with them, I guess you could call it. I'll place this down here. And then again, just dab over that stencil to lift up any excess ink. And you can lift it off. And it just adds a little bit of interest. I love it. So now we're going to add some more interest to the background using a stencil and some lunar paste from Simon Hurley. And I'm just going to position the stencil here on the background, kind of playing around with placement here a little bit. And then you can just use like a sticky mat or any kind of, you can also use like washi tape to help hold your stencil in place, or a grip mat. There's several different options. And the color here I've got is Gold Rush, and it is just a beautiful vintage gold color. It's so good. And I'm just going to apply that through the stencil using a palette knife here. And not looking for perfect coverage, but just enough to give me a little interest and color with that gold. All right, I'll just very carefully lift that up there. And then we can kind of flip it over and repeat that over on this side. There we go. Again, just apply a little bit of that paste through the stencil. As I said, I'm not really going for a perfect stencil coverage. So I'm going to kind of give it a little bit of a distressed feel by doing that. Again, we'll just lift that off. And then we're going to set this to the side and let it dry. And of course, then you're going to want to clean off your stencil as well. Now, if you've got some areas like where it didn't, I don't really like the way that looks, I'm just going to scoop that off before it dries. A little spot here, not really. There we go, kind of clean it up a little bit. And then, like I said, we'll just set this to the side and let it dry. It should dry pretty quickly, so let that dry. And then while it's drying, of course, then you're going to want to go and make sure you clean your stencil quickly. You don't want to let this dry on there. So sometimes I'll just mist it with a little water to kind of hold me over till I can get it to the sink. Another nice alternative is when you're working, is just have a little tray of water next to you, and then you can just put this in that tray, and then you can keep on working and clean everything up later on. All right, so now we're going to color in that dragonfly while we're waiting for that background to dry. And to do that, I'm going to use my Distress inks, so you can just smush a little bit of that onto your craft mat. And I'm using a water brush here to just pick up some of that ink and apply it to my dragonfly wings here. Now we're going to fussy cut this image, so if you want to fussy cut first and then color, you can. Kind of a personal preference there. And I'm just kind of loosey-goosey watercoloring this. And if you don't, another option with the watercoloring is you could also use the watercolor pencils if you like. Or you could use reinkers, add a little water, add a little drop of that to your craft mat. A little darker, add another little layer there. And then we're going to do that same thing with the walnut stain. The purple was the Dusty Concord. Just going to let those let them blend in a little bit there. And if you get out the lines, it's all good. We're going to color over that, or trim that out. All right, now give this a dry. So you might notice I've got some Distress spritz here as well, and I just thought with the dragonfly this would add just a really pretty touch of shimmer. So we're just going to make sure we shake this up really well, and just make sure you get that shaken up so all that pigment is mixed in. And then once I get it all mixed in, I'm just going to put some drops of it here onto my craft mat. And then I'm just going to take a regular paintbrush, and I'm going to use that to pick up that spritz, and apply it onto my image here. And if you have the mica stains, you could also use those, but I find that even though they're translucent, I find that they seem to cover up the stamped image a little bit more than the spritz do. And we're going to do that same thing with the walnut stain. If it seems like it's just not, not running enough, you can also grab your water brush, kind of add a little water to it and blend it out if you want. And here I'm just kind of going back in, adding a little bit of water, and just kind of blending these areas into each other just a little bit so it's not quite such a harsh line there. And then we can give that a dry. And trying to pick up that shimmer on camera can always be a little bit tricky, but in real life there's a really pretty, there we go, pretty shimmer on those wings from the spritz. And then the last thing I'm going to do here is just color in the body with some black soot. And then what would be ideal is if we had left this in our stamping platform and colored it in the stamping platform and then re-stamped it. That would really bring out all that stamped detail a little bit more, because you do lose a little bit of that stamped detail when you start coloring over it with the inks and the spritz, especially with the spritz. If you wanted to color this with the watercolor pencils, same thing. I would highly recommend leaving this in the stamping platform, coloring it in the stamp platform, don't move it, and then re-stamp the image, and it's just it'll make it pop. And then from here, I'm just gonna use some scissors to fussy cut. I am not going to try to fussy cut around the legs because we've already stamped this onto the background. The legs are already there, and then we'll just be able to layer it with the wings and the body to give you a little bit more interest that way. We've got this full sheet of paper, so instead of wasting it, what you can do is use it to stamp your sentiment. And you can also add the stamping with some other little embellishments, because on the finished card I use this little stamp to just add a little embellishment on it. And to do that, I'm just going to trim off that excess paper. We'll fussy cut this. And then from there we can just stamp the sentiments, whatever you want to use for that, it's fine. And so this little number image, just kind of making a little piece of ephemera to go onto this and add just a little bit more interest. So stamp those here with some archival ink. And then from here you can use your paper trimmer or scissors to just trim these down into little strips or rectangles here. So I'm just going to trim this into a little bit of a rectangle shape. And I'm just going to ink the edges of that with a little bit of the walnut stain and kind of getting the ink over the surface there a little bit. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to spritz that with some water, get that ink flowing. And then I'm just going to dry that with my heat tool. And that just kind of gives that piece a little bit of a distressed, aged effect. And then I'm going to take the back of my craft knife. So I'm rubbing not the sharp part, but the back side of the blade along the edge of my paper here, just to kind of distress it a little bit. You can also use your fingernails. I don't have super strong fingernails, so I don't tend to do that so much anymore, but you could do that as well. And then I'm going to ink that again, this time with a little bit of scorched timber. Just to give it a little bit more distress and get it on that end piece there, because I'm going to kind of fold that over. You can kind of crinkle it a little bit, rub over it with the ink or the ink to just give it a little more distress. And then you can kind of repeat that same thing with the sentiment strip as well. So once the paste is dry, the next step for the background is we're going to add some splatters using crackling campfire paint. And the reason I chose paint is I knew it would maintain its intensity and not kind of fade when I splattered it onto the background, because it's paint. It won't be as reactive with the background. So I'm just going to add a little bit of water off to the side here, and I've got a little splatter brush here. I'm going to mix in some of that water with my paint, kind of get it to where it's splatterable. Then pick that up. I'm just going to add the splatters here to my background. So just tap the brush with my finger, splatter it here and there as I like, and then set that to the side and let it dry. All right, so once everything's dry, the final step is to ink the edges of this panel with some scorched timber distress ink. Now, if you want to mat this onto some other layers of cardstock, go ahead and trim this down and then do the inking. Or you could, leave it as whatever size you created it and finish off the card. So then it's just a matter of adding those elements. So we've got the dragonfly that we're going to fussy cut and adhere with a little bit of foam tape. And then the other little embellishments, again, just popping those up with some foam tape to add a little bit of interest. And if you do decide to trim this down, just remember that you stamped that butterfly in the center of the paper. So you want to trim an even amount off all the way around, not chop it off all on one side, or things aren't going to be centered if you want it to be centered. Just something to keep in mind. You can find links to all the products I used in today's video in the YouTube description box. There's also a visual supply list that you can click on to see all of the supplies I used. Check out my blog post for photos and more information. If you're not already a subscriber to my channel, I'd love to have you. So please hit that subscribe button and be sure to hit the notification bell so you don't miss the next time I post. and here's another video that you might be interested in checking out. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, stay crafty, my friend.